Shaylin. Can all of you hear me? Okay, I'm going to try this lavalier so I can move around a little bit. Shaylin failed to mention in her introduction that I was also once the director of the Alabama Department of Archives and History. That was for a day back when I was at Boys State in 1970. I came down and got to meet Mr. Howard and spend a little time with him. And so I've had a love of history ever since that day. And it's wonderful what they've done with my building here since the day that I served as director. But I'm here today to talk about the Alabama Boys Industrial School, which is the state of Alabama's first home for any type of needy children. I think there were maybe some church or private homes that were predated this a little bit, but as far as the state of Alabama getting involved in some type of effort for needy children or wayward children, I believe this, in most historians' eyes, this is the first. My first association with Alabama Boys Industrial School came, as Shaylin mentioned, when I was a juvenile probation officer. I had just graduated from Samford University and went back home to Moulton, really to wait for an opportunity to go to graduate school that following fall in something far removed from my ultimate vocation. But while I was spending those 7 or 8 months waiting to admission into graduate school, the local juvenile judge asked if I would consider being the county's first juvenile probation officer. This was in the early 70s when the state was just trying to place juvenile probation officers in every county. So I told the local judge that I would try to do that and gave him a warning that I probably would just do this for 8 or 9 months and then leave in September to go to graduate school, but that I would help try to get the program started and do what I could. I ended up staying, as she said, for 7 years and changing my career path entirely and went into criminal justice instead of what I had planned to study. But at any rate, when I first started that juvenile probation job, I was given a small caseload to start me out and kind of start me slowly. And I had 3 little boys that were going to be on probation under me. And one of those, in fact, was an escapee from the Alabama Boys Industrial School. And this was now we're talking 1975. Little Ricky is what I'll refer to this young man. Little Ricky was an escapee from that school, and it was my duty to try to find him, and then once when we found him, to get him back and to readmit him into the school. So eventually he was found, and one of the deputies and I went down to the reform school with little Ricky to take him back. And we took him there to the school on the eastern side of Birmingham, which we just simply referred to back in those days as Roebuck, kind of colloquially called it by that name. So we took little Ricky to Roebuck, and we took him there to the counselor's office and said our goodbyes, and then we went across the highway there in the Roebuck Huffman area and got us a McDonald's hamburger and took the hour-and-a-half trip back to Moulton. When we pulled up in the parking lot of the courthouse and got out of the sheriff's car, one of the secretaries was walking across the parking lot, and she greeted us there in the parking lot and said, "Little Ricky's back in town." And we said, "What? We just left little Ricky about 2 hours ago at Roebuck." And she said, "I don't care where you left him, when you left him, but little Ricky has already been seen back in Moulton." Well, I always told my college students since that time that obviously little Ricky didn't stop for a hamburger. He came straight back. Escaping from the Alabama Boys Industrial School at that time, the word escape is really giving the boys too much credit. The school did not even have a fence around it until the 1990s. That was all part of the philosophy of the school that we're going to discuss here today. But that was my first association with the school. And as a 22, 23-year-old juvenile probation officer, I was not concerned at all at that time about the history of the school. I was thinking more about keeping my little kids in check and trying to get them on the right path than thinking about this very unusual and this very prestigious school that I was taking these kids to. It was later when I was teaching and doing research for my classes that I dug a little deeper and discovered that the school had a very rich history, a very long legacy, that it had been founded, in fact, in the late 1800s, and that it had been in existence already for nearly a century when I first became acquainted with it. But I want to tell you today about the founding of the school and also some of the remarkable leaders that helped make the school what it became. and what it still is. As you'll see as we conclude, the school is still very much in existence today and still carrying out its mission even to this day. But any history of the Alabama Boys Industrial School must start with a young lady named Elizabeth Johnston Evans. Elizabeth was born in North Carolina in 1851. Of course, this predated the Civil War. Her father ultimately was a Civil War general. And a lot of Elizabeth's character was formed by some things that happened during her childhood. Elizabeth had what most of us would term to be a very idyllic childhood. She lived a very comfortable life. We all know from our studies that life in the South during the pre-Civil War era was not always quite as glamorous as the movies and the novels project it to be. But in Elizabeth's case, it was very true to life. Her father was very wealthy and had a plantation and very aristocratic. So she had what would have normally been a very idyllic childhood, except for two tragedies that occurred in her life. First of all, her father was captured by the Union Army, and he ultimately died in a Civil War prisoner of war camp. Also, another occurrence during her childhood was that she contracted diphtheria. That's a disease or a malady that we don't hear a lot about today, but it was something that was very common during that era. And it affected her hearing. She had diminished hearing for the rest of her life because of that diphtheria. And looking back, some of her biographers and other accounts of her life say that those two tragedies, the death of her father in a Civil War camp and her contracting diphtheria, helped to embed in her three great qualities. One of these was that it deepened her Christian faith. She became a Christian at late childhood, early teens, and that only deepened her Christian faith. It also gave her a compassion for others that were less fortunate than Elizabeth. And also it helped to instill in her some courage that she's going to need in abundance as she begins to tackle the things that lie ahead of her, unbeknownst to her, of course, at that time. But Elizabeth Evans married General Robert Johnston, who was a Civil War veteran himself. They married in the late 1800s. And as events progressed, they moved to Birmingham in the 1870s, 1880s of some sort, so that Elizabeth's husband, Robert, could pursue a career probably in business or in banking. And when Elizabeth moved and her family to Birmingham, it brought about a whole change in her lifestyle. They were accustomed to Charlotte, and of course Charlotte at that time was much more established than Birmingham, and had more things of a societal type nature, clubs and organizations, and just a little bit more of a genteel type of atmosphere than Birmingham. As you know, Birmingham during that era was very rough and tumble type of mining town. But Elizabeth still threw herself into the life there in Birmingham and got involved in a number of notable things. She was one of the founders of the Highland Book Club, which is still in existence today. She and her family were founders of South Highland Presbyterian Church, which is still there today. She was one of the early leaders of the Alabama Federation of Women's Clubs. So she really threw herself into Birmingham society. And one of the things she also began doing was teaching Sunday school at the Pratt Mines. This is Elizabeth here during her first year or so at the helm of the school. So this would have been very similar also to Elizabeth's image when she and her husband got involved in Birmingham. But Elizabeth and her husband, primarily Elizabeth, began teaching Sunday school at this Pratt mine. This was an era when youngsters were thrown right into the adult prison system, just like adults. And this was also a time when a lot of adult prisoners were leased out to private companies. There have been a number of books about the inmate leasing system in the South, when railroads and mines and timber industries would lease inmates from the state. And it was, in their view, at least a win-win situation, because it took some of the cost of caring for those inmates away from the state, but it also provided these companies with low-cost labor. So it was an atrocious way, though, to house inmates, and states all over the South did this as a way of caring for prisoners. As you can see here, they built sort of a makeshift prison, at this mine, and they would work inmates. And little boys were thrown into that situation just like adult men. And Elizabeth noticed this when she would go to teach Sunday school classes there at the mine. And it really came to her head one day when she was at the mine, and one of these boys was visiting with his mother. It was a Sunday afternoon, which obviously must have been their visiting day for families as well. And Elizabeth noted a mother that was visiting with her young boy. The boy was probably somewhere 13 to 15 years of age. The guard came to lead the mother away because visiting hours were coming to a conclusion. And as the mother was literally torn away from her little boy, the mother cried just to anyone that would listen, "Oh, who is going to take care of my boy now?" And the mother, weeping, sobbing, was led away. And it really just broke Elizabeth's heart to see that little boy in that situation and the turmoil that it caused the family of that little boy. So she made a pledge to herself and really to her Lord that if circumstances permitted, if He would bless her, if He would help her, if people would help her, that she would do something to try to get these boys out of such atrocious conditions, being thrown into prison with these adult inmates. She began to talk openly about it to anyone who would listen. Word kind of got around the prison mind as to what she wanted to do. One day, one of the inmates came up to her one Sunday afternoon when she was again teaching the Bible study. And this inmate pressed an envelope to her hand and said, "Ms. Johnston, this is for the home you want to build for the little boys." Ms. Johnston put the envelope in her purse. She didn't have time to look at it at that moment with her other duties there at the prison that afternoon. But later that evening when she got back to Birmingham, got back home, she opened the envelope and it had $100 in it. And of course, I hope all of us realize the significance of that. I think for most of us, we'd like to have $100 in our pocket right now. But can you imagine, this was 1898, 1899, and this was an adult prisoner who had that kind of money that he had acquired somehow through his family or through some means in the prison, gambling or whatever he might have done. But here was an adult prisoner in 1899 giving Ms. Johnston $100. He said, "I want you to put this toward the home you're going to build for these little boys." Well, Ms. Johnston was just overcome by that, overwhelmed by that. Years later, she would still say that $100 from that prisoner was the most significant contribution that she ever received for the home. So Ms. Johnston began to talk more openly with her friends at church and at the women's clubs about how they could get this home started. And the conclusion came that the only way that they would ever do it was to go to the legislature and try to get financial assistance from the legislature. So with the support of the Alabama Federation of Women's Clubs, Ms. Johnston more or less became the representative to approach the legislature. This is a partial view of the legislative body sometime in the late 1890s. This may not have been the exact group of men that Ms. Johnston approached, but I'm sure some of them are. And you can see it's a very august-looking group. As I tell folks, I'm a grown man, and I'd hate to approach that group to ask for anything. Pretty sour-looking bunch, and you know they all seem to shop at the same department store. They all are all dressed remarkably alike, aren't they? But this is the group and some of the committees that spawned from this legislative body that Ms. Johnston approached. Her first meeting, however, was with the Attorney General. She, through some connections she had through her brother-in-law, she got an entree to the Attorney General to talk to him about this project, since the Attorney General is the more or less titular head of law enforcement and criminal justice in a particular state. That was a logical person to see. So she went to approach the Attorney General. The conversation did not go very well. First thing he said to Ms. Johnston was, "Ms. Johnston, why don't you and your lady friends go on back home and let us men attend to this problem?" Well, obviously someone of Ms. Johnston, as we said, courage, did not take that very well. She had a conversation with the Attorney General that went something like this. She asked him, "What does your wife do every day of the week?" And he said, "Well, she plays cards about 6 days of the week." And she said, "Well, if your wife and her friends like to play cards, that's well and good. But my friends and I, we want to do something for the little boys of Alabama." And she turned around on her heels and left his office. So it obviously didn't get off to a great start. But she started talking to these different committee chairmen, I'm sure the appropriations committees and others, about this school. And they all, at least to her face, said it was a noble idea, but that they just didn't think she had time to do it this session, that she needed more time to, I guess, lay the groundwork and so forth. But she kept pressing on. No, I want it put in. I want it put in. She had prepared a bill herself that gave the main points and the outline of what she wanted this home to be and how she wanted it to be organized and administered. And she kept putting the bill in, and all these committee chairmen would tell her, well, they've changed this, they've changed that. Finally, as the session came to a conclusion, one of the chairmen said to her, Ms. Johnston, I think we might as well withdraw the bill as it's currently been done after all the changes that all these folks have made. You're just not going to be pleased with it even if it did pass. And she said, no, put it in, let's see what happens, put it in. So they put it in the hopper, as they say, and it went before the legislature. And she spent the night in Montgomery that night waiting to see what the outcome would be. The next morning she awoke and saw a newspaper, the morning newspaper, and the headline said, legislature passes boys' school bill. She took the newspaper and looked at it. And that day they would often have the bill in its entirety printed in the newspaper. The bill was there, and she was amazed that not a single word had been changed from the one that she originally submitted. And this was after all of these men, all these committee chairmen told her the bill had been changed and ripped to shreds, that she would not even recognize it. But when it finally passed, it was word for word like she had submitted it. She went to the Capitol. A lot of the legislators approached her in the Capitol. Said, Ms. Johnston, we just don't understand. It came out exactly like you had written it. That's not at all the way we saw it last night when we went to bed. And Ms. Johnston said, it was just the Lord's work and you men couldn't stop it. So she basically gave the credit to her Lord, to God, for somehow getting that bill through the way that she wanted it. That particular bill, I want to mention just a couple of things about it. It said that kids could go to this school that were between the ages of 6 and 18. They could go for a number of reasons. They could be abused. They could be neglected. They could be vagrants. A number of factors that played into it, but the majority of them would be there because of delinquent behavior, what we now know as delinquency, committing minor crimes of some sort. Another provision that was very significant, and one that the legislators had attempted to change, but somehow, as we said, it came through just the way she wanted it. But she demanded that the school be administered by 7 women. When asked why she was so determined that women govern this school, she said that only a mother's love could understand what these little boys need, that it needs to be governed by women who can understand these little boys from a mother's perspective. So the school was created. The legislature appropriated $4,000 to go toward the establishment of the school. Would those of you here within seeing distance of the Capitol that have lived in Montgomery, probably most of you for most of your lives, would you be astounded if I tell you the legislature never came forward with that $4,000? Are any of you shocked? They reneged on that money as the year went along and said there were more quote unquote pressing needs that money needed to go to when the time came. But the school did get off the ground with a donation, similar donation in amount from the Commercial Club of Birmingham, which I assume was something probably similar to the Chamber of Commerce or maybe something like the Rotary Club. I'm not sure exactly. It was just known as the Commercial Club of Birmingham. They came through with a donation, and Ms. Johnston and her group were able to purchase the land. When they purchased the land there in the East Lake Roebuck section of Birmingham, this was the only structure that was on the property. Now you can see there in the background there are some other buildings that were built later, but the old log cabin still remained for years even after the other campus grew around it. But that log cabin was the only structure on the property. These boys here were among the first ones that were admitted. Of course, this school was for white boys at that time. Of course, segregation was very common across the nation. A school for African American kids is going to be opened about 10 or 11 years later. But this particular school was just for white kids. And you can see the picture of some of those boys. The Birmingham police chief, there were 3 boys that were admitted on the very first day, which was in June 22nd, 1900. The superintendent of the school that time, who was a Mr. Griffin, picked up those boys at different stops around Birmingham where they were being held by the police or their parents or other entities till he could get around, make the rounds, and pick them up He carried them by trolley car back to the school there in Eastlake. But those first 3 boys, the police chief in Birmingham said these were the baddest boys in Birmingham. The baddest boys in Birmingham. Their offenses, one of them was for running away from home to join the circus. One of them was for truancy. And the other one was for some type of, the third one was for jumping on the trolley car and not paying his fare. So running away to join the circus, jumping on the trolley car without paying his fare, and truancy. Those were the 3 baddest boys in Birmingham. What do you think the 3 baddest boys in Montgomery would be right now, or the 3 baddest boys in Birmingham? Probably be murder, or rape, or armed robbery, something of that sort. But in that day, that was the description. That was the rap sheet of these 3 worst boys in Birmingham. With the failure of the legislature to come through, Ms. Johnston had to vigorously beat the streets, literally, trying to find donors and contributors who would help keep the school afloat, since the legislature had failed to come through. And the money from the commercial club primarily just went to buying the property and maybe a month or 2 of existence. So Ms. Johnston began to roam the streets of Birmingham, literally knocking on doors. And one thing about Ms. Johnston, wherever she went knocking on doors and seeking donors, she was always praying. I mentioned her tremendous Christian faith. That was just a part of her that you couldn't separate. That was always the fabric of her life. One day she was walking in Birmingham, literally on the sidewalks, praying for guidance as to where she should go to seek a contribution. And she found herself by this bank. Those of you familiar with Alabama history or with Birmingham, this is a Steiner Brothers bank building back in that era. And that building is still there today. But Ms. Johnston went into the Steiner Brothers Bank and asked to see the president. She was ushered into the president's office and made her plea and explained the need behind the school and what she was trying to do. Mr. Steiner listened very patiently, and he said, Ms. Johnston, the bank just cannot loan you any money because you don't have any collateral. And Ms. Johnston she thanked him for his time, began to gather up her coat and her purse to make her exit. And he said, but Ms. Johnston, wait just a minute. I said, the bank couldn't loan you any money. He said, I will personally, out of my own pocket, lend you the amount that you're requesting here today. So she was just, again, overwhelmed and just so pleased and appreciative of what he had done. She began to say her goodbyes and was going to leave the office. And as she exited his office, Mr. Steiner said, Ms. Johnston, may I ask you one last thing before you leave? And she said, certainly. Why, of all places, did you come here? How did you find yourself here? And she said, well, I was walking the streets of Birmingham praying as to where I should go to seek this donation. And I thought of a verse in Psalms that said, I cried unto the Lord and he set me in a large place. That building there was her large place. She saw that building as the answer to that prayer, as the signal, as this is where you need to go. This is your large place. So Ms. Johnston did that repeatedly. The book tells of other things that she did to try to raise money and to get contributions of labor and materials and so forth. The first building on the campus is this one here. This was started immediately upon inhabiting that log cabin. The staff and the boys began constructing their ultimate home, and this was the resulting building that they constructed. A lot, again, with donated materials, donated labor, and so forth. In 1905, Ms. Johnston and her sisters, there on the board of directors, made what I think is the most significant decision that the school ever made. And that was the hiring of David and Catherine Weekley to be the superintendent. They had one superintendent that I mentioned, Mr. Griffin. They had an interim superintendent after Mr. Griffin left their employment. And now they were seeking what would be their second actual permanent superintendent. Ms. Johnston and her board had traveled literally all over the country looking at schools to serve as somewhat of a model for their school. She may have learned about this young couple on one of those travels. David Weekley, who I'll continually refer to through our time here today, is Colonel Weekley. Colonel Weekley and his wife had been the assistant superintendent and assistant matron at a similar school in Nashville. And she may have met the Weekleys, or at least heard about him in her visit there at some point. But Ms. Johnston and the board sent a Reverend Hall, an Episcopal minister in Birmingham, to be their emissary, so to speak, to go and talk to Colonel and Mrs. Weekley about coming to be the superintendent of this new fledgling school in Birmingham. Reverend Hall made an appointment with the Weekleys there in Nashville and talked with them and explained the women and their vision, what they wanted to do, and so forth. Colonel Weekley and his wife talked it over and very politely thanked the Reverend Hall for their interest, but said they just didn't see that as what they were being led to do. They were quite comfortable, quite happy, felt fulfilled there in Nashville. But that they would certainly join the ladies there in Birmingham in praying for a fine superintendent, but they just didn't think that it was them. Well, Reverend Hall asked them to please pray about the school, helping them find a superintendent. He went back to Birmingham. 3 or 4 months later, he returned to Nashville to speak to the Weekleys. And when the conversation began, he informed them that the Board of Trustees in Birmingham had voted them in as the new superintendent and matron. Well, Colonel Weekley was kind of amazed. He said, we didn't apply for this. We told you we just really didn't feel led to do this. And he said, well, all I can tell you is Ms. Johnston and the board have voted you in. And they're back in Birmingham right now, literally at this hour while we're here. They're having a prayer meeting there in the offices, praying that you will accept this position. Well, Colonel and Ms. Weekley said that they would think about it overnight. Reverend Hall stayed overnight there in Nashville. And the next day, after talking about it and praying about it, they told Reverend Hall that they really didn't understand why they were giving him this answer, that there was no earthly reason at all why they should accept this position, but that for some reason they felt they had to go. So they accepted the position, and they went to take on those 2 positions as superintendent and matron in 1905. Colonel Weekley had many characteristics of his own that I like to point out. Just as Ms. Johnston had those 3 prevailing characteristics in her life, Colonel Weekley had some characteristics too. One was his uncanny wisdom that I'll speak more about in just a minute. Another was his uncommon patience. And then finally, he had unconditional love for these boys that we'll see, and I'll try to demonstrate in just a few little anecdotes about Colonel Weekley. But Colonel Weekley, lest I forget to tell you this, let me mention it now in case I don't want it to get away, this astounding fact. When Colonel Weekley and his wife went to the school in 1905, they stayed a phenomenal 43 years as the superintendent and matron. He retired in 1948. And as someone who worked with delinquent boys for 7 years, I can tell you, for somebody to work with them for over 40 years, he had to have uncommon patience and uncanny wisdom and unconditional love to be able to deal with that type of clientele for 43 years. Sometimes as many as 600 at a time would be the population of the school. But Colonel Weekley, as I said, he had uncanny wisdom. Let me mention just one thing about Colonel Weekley's wisdom. This is a picture that I've come upon since the book was published, that shows Colonel Weekley and his wife Catherine riding an old vintage motorized bicycle. I've told some of the groups that I've spoken to, I'm sure Mike and Frank on Pickers would love to get a hold of that bicycle if they could. But Colonel Weekley, to show about his wisdom, there was a young boy one day that was there at the school named Archibald. And Archibald was continually running away from the school. And they would find him and bring him back, kind of like I did with little Ricky 70 years later. But they would find Archibald and bring him back. He would run away again. Find him, bring him back. A few days, he would run away again. Colonel Weekley was talking to Archibald one day, and he said, "Archibald, why do you continually run away from home, run away from the school?" And Archibald said, "Well, Colonel, sometimes I just feel like I've just got to go. Something just gets to me and I've just got to go." And Colonel said, "Well, Archibald, I feel that way sometimes too. Things get me down too. The next time you feel like you've just got to go, come and see me and I'll go with you." So one day Colonel was in his office and Archibald burst in a rush and said, "Colonel, I've got to go." And Colonel said, just a minute, let me get my hat." He picked up his old fedora hat And they left the campus together and went out in the woods and the fields all around the campus. At that time, Roebuck and Eastlake was very much unsettled in terms of businesses or homes. It was very, very rough terrain, unsettled, as I said. So they went out and wandered the woods and so forth and stayed most of the day. Colonel Weekley happened to have some string in his pocket, or maybe he carried it just for this purpose, but he had some string in his pocket, and they made him a makeshift fishing line and fished for a while, and they ate berries and things they could find there in the woods, and they'd been gone most of the day. And finally, Archibald said, "Well, Colonel, I think I'm ready to go back." And Colonel Weekley said, "Well, Archibald, you know I am too." So they went back to the school, and Archibald never ran away again. Now, why? I think it was because Colonel had the wisdom to see that boy just needed a little attention, needed a little unconditional love, and knew just what to do to calm that boy down and to show that boy a little unconditional love. Another story that I like to tell involved much later, and again it shows the involvement of the school, much later, probably in the 30s or 40s. Colonel Weekley took his automobile there to the shop on campus, and it was making a noise, making a racket. He took it there to the boys in the auto mechanics class to see if they could do something with it. He left it there. About the close of the day, he went back to the garage where they worked on the cars. He went into the garage and he literally saw the motor of his car that had been completely lifted from the car and was in a gazillion pieces on the floor all around the garage. And he said, "Colonel, I think I found out what it is, something about the rings or the gaskets or whatever." And Colonel was just amazed. He didn't know if his car would ever get back in one piece and have all the pieces actually fit somewhere and not still a few laying on the side somewhere. But the boy assured him that he would fix it. It would be fine in the morning. So Colonel went back the next morning. The boy worked all night. The next morning the car was back together perfectly, and the car was, we say, running like a top. But again, I think that would have tested my patience a little bit if I went in and saw my car in a gazillion pieces on the floor. So again, that shows me his patience. And again, with Archibald, it shows his love and his wisdom as well. When Colonel and Ms. Weekley took over, they immediately expanded the campus in a number of ways. Physical expansion, but also programmatic expansion. This is one of my favorite pictures, as you'll see. This is a picture that's on the cover of the book, but it shows the boys there in the front doing some work, and it shows sort of a panorama of some of the early buildings. Eventually grew to have over 20 buildings on the campus, dormitories, barns, work area, and so forth. This you only see 4 or 5, but it grew much larger than this as time went on. They also expanded it programmatically. The school went from just almost nothing, or literally nothing, to being a very advanced school. Now remember, folks, this school we're talking about is what we would today call a reform school. This was not some nice high school in Birmingham or Montgomery. This was a reform school. They had classes that eventually would cover algebra, physics, Latin, things of that sort. Subjects that would make kids in today's high schools, and certainly in today's reform schools, make their heads spin if they thought they had to learn Latin and physics and algebra and things of that sort. I read one early report, shows you how much remedial work they had to do to catch these boys up. One early report said that the boys, for instance, in the second grade, ranged from ages 9 to 17. And those were second graders, 9 to 17. And only about 10% of the boys that were admitted to the school over the years were in school at the time of their admission. They had dropped out of school, runaways, and so forth. So only 10% of the typical boys at the school were in school at the time that they actually were admitted. So they had a great academic program. They also had a great vocational program in which they taught an array of trades. At one time, as many as 26 different trades that went the gamut from things in the early years like blacksmithing. But as time evolved, that blacksmithing turned into auto mechanics. So they were always evolving and keeping up with the current trends and what the job market was from one day to the next. They had a school newspaper that started very early on called the Boys Banner, and it actually existed until the 1970s. They printed it there at the print shop. I showed that was an example of a printing class there as one of many vocations that they had. So they not only wrote the ingredients, the articles for most of the papers, but they also did the printing of the paper there on site. They had athletic teams that football, baseball, basketball, as well as individual things like boxing and track and things of that sort. One of the most unusual things about the school, when I first started researching it, these couple of these items had already faded away by the time that I began to work with the school. But back in Colonel Weekley's day, they also had an advanced military program. The boys did drills and things of that sort. Shaylin, am I running out of time? Pardon? Okay. They had military programs, military drill. Here you can see they would go out and have an encampment around the area. They had a band. Again, this amazed me for a reform school to have a musical marching band. They had a band there at the school. This is one of the early years. This next picture was one that came to me later after the book was printed, but this one, I just love this one because you can see the little boys' faces so clearly, and some of them look like kids that would do no more than run away to join the circus or whatever. They don't exactly look like hardened criminals in that picture, do they? This is a picture later on as the band continued to develop even more. The older gentleman in the middle of the picture there is the famous composer and conductor John Philip Sousa. He came to Birmingham on other business and asked if he could conduct this band in a number because he had already heard of their renown and how great they were. Knowing Ms. Johnston's background, you would also know obviously that religion was a part of the school. This was in a day when religion was not quite so frowned upon in terms of being a part of a state institution. This was the chapel at that day. This is the chapel today. It's one of the few buildings of the original buildings that still exist there at the campus. So a number of programs that the Weekleys implemented there at the school that made it so unique. One final story that I want to tell you before I begin wrapping it up. Colonel Weekley was obviously a star of this school, one of the main features of the book. Ms. Johnston obviously is. But the boys themselves were very much a part of this story and a part of the book. And their story weaves all through the fabric of the book. One final story I want to tell you that is probably my favorite story. One day Colonel Weekley was hosting a college professor, a psychology professor, that was touring schools of this nature all over the country. And she had a theory that she was talking to different administrators about. She had a theory that schools of this type, and even adult prisons as well, often the boys would have nicknames that they would place on each other. And she felt that these nicknames were very harmful, that it would damage the self-esteem of these youngsters to have these somewhat negative nicknames that each of them would call each other. Well, Colonel Weekley admitted in his diary that he really didn't put a lot of stock in her theory, but he tried to placate and appease the lady, and he told her that he really didn't think that was a concern or an issue there at their school, but certainly if he noticed anything of this sort going on, he would, try to deal with it. Well, she was most pleased at Colonel's response, and she just praised him and bragged on him in terms of how enlightened he was in terms of his attitude about being an administrator of such a facility, that he wouldn't allow this kind of behavior to go on. So, he was pleased with that. She told him, by the way, that when I write my book about this theory, I'm going to be sure to mention you prominently in the book because of your enlightened attitude. So they got up and began to leave, and he was ushering her to the door, and as she opened the door, a little boy came rushing in. And she patted the little boy on the head and said, "My sonny, you must be the smallest boy here." And he said, "Oh, no, ma'am. Polecat's littler than me." So anyway, Colonel Weekley said later that after she heard that he doubted that their school made her book after all, after she heard about Polecat being one of the boys there at the school. Ms. Johnston was a face there at the school from the time of its founding in 1934. Some of her last years, she actually lived on campus in a little cottage that they built for her. She remained the chair of the Board of Trustees until her death in 1934. This picture here shows her a few years later that would probably be sometime close to her passing. Colonel Weekley, as I said, he stayed until 1948. And you can see there a great change in him also from that first picture I showed you of he and his wife together. This picture is a picture of the three of them together. Ms. Johnston there on the left and Colonel Weekley in the center, and then Ms. Weekley there on the far right. And that's in front, by the way, of the little cottage that the school built for Ms. Johnston, that she could actually spend her latter years of her life there at the school. As I said, the school is still present today, but it is much, much different, both in terms of character and also the physical surroundings. This is one of the typical dorms today. This is the interior of one of the dorms. You can see today it looks just like a prison would. Nothing much charming about it like might have been in the day that we talked about. This is the administration building, and fittingly it's named the Elizabeth Johnston Administration Building, and it's there close to the front of the campus. In conclusion, a lot of folks have asked me, why can't we have something like this today? This program seemed to work so well. Colonel Weekley, in his own primitive way, of course, we didn't have statistics and means of keeping statistics in that day like we do today, but in his own primitive, simple way, he tried to keep track of his boys to see how they turned out. And about 75% of them turned out positive. They went on to lead a great life, a productive life. Today, it's just the reverse of that. About 75% of kids who go to schools like Mount Meigs or Vaca or Chalkville, our three institutions for kids today, about 75% of them fail and come back into the criminal justice system. So folks ask, why can't we do that today? Why can't we implement his program today? Would it work today? And regrettably, as much as I admire it, I say no, it probably wouldn't work today. Because so much has changed. Society has changed. The American family has changed. 75% of these boys, even the boys that went to this school, still had both of their natural parents. Today, most of the kids who go to these top schools only have one parent, period, that are trying to do the best they can to raise those kids. So family life has changed. Society has changed. These kids had to work. When I did my interviews with their superintendent today and asked them, I would go there and the school looked like it needed a good grass mowing or the window trim needed painting. I would say, why can't the boys help kind of fix this place up a little bit? Oh, no. We couldn't allow that. If some of them got hurt, we'd be sued. If we had a little boy mowing the yard, mowing the grass, and he cut his toe with a lawnmower, we'd be sued for everything we've got. So much has changed. The type of crimes that kids commit have changed. We talked about that a few minutes ago. So even though the program in its entirety wouldn't work today, I still think there are a few things that would work today, and I close with this. First of all, I think an emphasis on work, maybe not actually making the boys do some work, but at least teaching them vocational training so that they can find a job when they leave a place like this. I think discipline is still important. It doesn't have to be military drills and things of that sort, but some type of discipline that teaches these young men how to discipline themselves when they're adults and how to set their own limits when there's no one there to set limits for them. I also think introducing boys to a spiritual element is important. Here in today's time, it's pretty much taboo to mention anything about a God of any type, whether it's our Christian God or whether it's a God from Islam or some other faith. Anything about religion is pretty much taboo in a state institution today. But I think we need to get back to having a type of system where a boy can at least be introduced to a spiritual side of life, because I think for most of us that's something that's very important. And then finally, I think even in today's society that we've got to have workers, leaders like Ms. Johnston and like Colonel Weekley that have an unconditional love for these kids. It's hard to like some of these kids because of some of the things they've done, because of their attitudes, their personality. But somehow, if you're going to work in the juvenile justice system, you've got to have some unconditional love for these kids that you're working with. So the last line in my book, I'll leave it here with you folks today, is that I still have hope for America's juvenile justice system. But I think we need a whole new generation of David Weekleys and Elizabeth Johnston, somebody who's willing to give their lives and their hearts to trying to help these kind of kids. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
How many children are in these facilities now in Alabama?
They're much smaller than they were back in this day. The average population now at VACA, which is now what this school is called, is probably just around 100. Department of Youth Services, VACA, V as in Victor, VACA campus. That's another little sort of a sore spot with me. I think it ought to be called Johnston campus or Weekley campus or something, but it's about 100.
That's all?
Mm-hmm. It's much smaller now. Part of the reason for that is not because crime is lessened, but it's because the emphasis in juvenile justice now is to try to treat as many of the youngsters as possible in their own home through things like probation or something of that sort. So only kind of, I guess you say, the worst of the worst actually are sent to a DYS campus, Department of Youth Services campus.
So there are 100 buyouts. How many are there in the whole system? How many facilities are there?
3. Probably total, maybe 400 or 500.
Wow. That seems very cost-effective.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
You mentioned
Can I actually ask you to use this microphone just so it's recorded?
Sorry.
You mentioned that there had been an African-American school established about 10 years later. Could you comment just a little bit on that and what happened? I guess, of course, it eventually incorporated.
Yeah, I'm not as knowledgeable about that, but it's the school that's out here close to Montgomery at Mount Meigs. It had a history, or has a history, somewhat similar to Roebuck, because it initially started through the efforts of some people in the African American community that basically started it, and then the state came on board, much like they did at Roebuck, to come across with funding later. But the school at Mount Meigs is now for both races, formerly was just African American. Just a little known piece of trivia about that school: the famous baseball pitcher Satchel Paige was a former resident out at Mount Meigs when he was just a child. So, but it started in it was either 1910 or 1911, and it was also started due to the influence of an African American civic club before the state took it over. Yes.
There are pictures that you show of the boys. That surprised me that many of them. Without a pretty.
That's pretty. They organized the whole school into that kind of regiment. Every boy participated in that. That wasn't just a voluntary or one program that they had. The entire campus was incorporated into different regiments, and they would march and compete against each other and so forth.
About what years was that?
That would have been probably from its inception to probably not sure exactly when that part went out, but it was after the Second World War. It went on up through the Second World War, at least. And the book, I've forgotten the numbers off the top of my head, but the book has a chapter about that and tells how many of the boys from Roebuck eventually served in World War I and World War II, and it was a tremendous number. In fact, one of the first group of boys ever at the school went to World War I and was eventually killed in battle during World War I. Yes.
Did the Johnstons and Weekleys have children of their own?
Yes, they did. Ms. Johnston, I think, had about 8 children of her own. I don't know how many Colonel Weekley eventually had, but his first child was a little girl, and she died as a result of typhoid fever that swept the campus, I think around 1918 or so. So he actually gave one of his own children up, or lost one of his own children through his service to the school when he stayed at the school, and his family lived there when typhoid fever hit, and it took his own child. She was about 3 or 4 years old when she died because of that.
In your research, did you go through the House or Senate journals to check on that bill and how it might have made it into the hopper in its original format? No,
ma'am, I didn't. That would have been a good exercise to do, but I didn't research that in terms of how that phenomenal outcome occurred. I did. Shaylin, if I've got just a minute, let me tell one quick story to the military. I kind of skipped over this because I thought I was running out of time, but you could see there they did marching and military drills and all of that. One day a year they had a special thing called Military Appreciation Day or something, And the National Guard commander from here at Montgomery would come up and actually review the troops and see how these boys were doing as they marched and drilled and so forth. Colonel Weekley said that over time the boys began asking him if they could adopt dogs that came on campus and keep them for a pet. Maybe one dorm would have a dog each. And these boys would, in the sewing shop, they would make a dog a little uniform just like they wore. And they trained the dogs to walk with them as they marched and to halt when they stopped and to turn when they turned. One of these days in the spring when they were having this special day, the boys, all the different troops had their pet dog in uniform marching along. Some of them, they even made little insignia to go on the dog's blanket. And one day they were marching, and here's the one-star general from Montgomery with his lieutenant. Some of you military guys will know more about this. I think that was a brigadier general, the general from Montgomery. And the boys come by, and the general from Montgomery has his lieutenant with him that's escorted him to Birmingham. And all of a sudden, here comes a troop of boys marching perfectly in sync, and here's their dog. And he has the 2 stars of a major general. The general on the reviewing stand is a 1-star brigadier general. The lieutenant says, "Sir, it looks like you've been outranked here today." The dog was a higher rank than the general from Montgomery. But Colonel Weekley, ever the astute public relations person, he made a ruling from that point on, no dog could be higher than a private. He wanted to make sure something embarrassing like that didn't happen again. But any other questions? I know our time's about gone for those of you that have to rush back to work. But I appreciate your spending your lunch hour learning a little bit more about the Alabama Boys Industrial School. And as Shaylin said, there are some books out in the hallway if any of you would like to have one to read more of these stories and more of the history. Any other final questions?
How much vocational training is done in these schools now?
Today, most of the vocational work has been moved to the school at Mount Meigs. The school today, this one, the one that we've just discussed, is mainly devoted to academic work for kids who are younger. Like most of the kids sent to Roebuck today would be between, say, 12 and 16. Those that are maybe 16 to 18 are sent to Mount Meigs. So that's where the vocational emphasis is. The ones at Roebuck today would still be just given basic academics because it would be assumed they would go back to regular school when they're released, whereas these older boys might go directly to the workforce.
What's the average amount of time a child is done?
Not long today. Usually around a year.
How many properties there? Yeah.
It's still pretty much the entire piece of land. It's over 100 acres. It's some prime real estate now because East Lake and Roebuck and all of that have just basically grown around it. And there was a time when the Department of Youth Services was tempted to sell it off because they thought they could get big dollar for it. But during one of the years there was a budget crunch. They thought, well, here's where we can get some money. But they decided to keep the money that not to make a foolish decision just to get 1 year's budget up to speed. Okay, Shayla, I'll turn it back over to you. Pardon?
Where did the bad girls go, or were there not?
There was eventually a school around that same era, 1910, 1911, that was opened at Chalkville, which is out around Trussville. And Chalkville has now closed because of severe storm damage at one of the tornadoes that hit Birmingham a few years ago. And they are reopening a female facility on the same physical property as Mount Meigs. It will be a separate school, but it's on land that adjoins Mount Meigs. So that there's about to be a new girls' school right here in the Birmingham area, Montgomery area out at Mount Meigs. But for around a century, the girls were at Chalkville, there outside of Birmingham.
There's only one girls' facility.
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. Let's give a round of applause.